Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody to the second of our Hub Cures speaker series. If you were here last week, as I mentioned, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. we're going to highlight a speaker from a Massachusetts institution that is, leading the effort to respond to this pandemic that the world is facing. And this Hub Cure speaker series will lead up to our MULSI 2020 plus, MULSI Plus 2020 event on August 20th. So we are recording these speakers, and the recordings will be available to all registrants of the MULSI Plus event. Registration for the MULSI Plus event, which by the way will also be virtual this year, we won't be at the Cambridge Marriott. That registration will be open tomorrow, and we've reduced the paywall considerably for all of those who are interested in MULSI, but it's going to be the same type of event, lots of interaction and abilities to meet sort of up and coming academic spinouts, a lot like the one we're going to talk about today, Sherlock Biosciences. Please welcome CEO Rahul Dhanda. Welcome, Rahul.
Thank you very much, Vineet. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, so we're kind of in this odd situation where both of us are sitting either in our bedrooms or outside our bedrooms having this conversation. This is like the new normal.
Yes, it is. It has become, I've done it probably 10, 12 hours a day for the last couple of months.
I know, you and me both. So, we've got an audience that's obviously very interested in the pandemic response, but is also very interested in academic spinouts. That's kind of our world and constituency. And Sherlock is like almost the poster child of an academic spinout. Tell us a little bit about the origin story and this large founding team of great scientists and yourself.
Yeah, it's really a remarkable group of people. It's an honor to be a founder amongst them, and the company came together in concept in early 2018. Although I think the wheels were set in motion in 2017. I first heard about it before it was even a company. I was at my last organization, which is a commercial stage biotech. We had launched product, preparing for launch more product, and I was responsible for the business. And a number of people kept sending me a paper. It was a paper about the use of CRISPR in diagnostics, and because it was a science paper, it's a research paper, it wasn't something I spent a lot of time on. In fact, I didn't even read it until about the 10th person sent it to me, one of our investors, and said, I really want your opinion on this. And so I read the paper. And I remember putting it away and thinking some lucky person is going to run this company someday. Mm-hmm. And then forgot about it. And then an incredible thing happened about 2 months later. I got a phone call from David Walt, who, founder of Illumina, incredible accomplishments.
And, by the way, David was our lunch keynote at MULSI last year.
Oh, okay. So David, as well, and is a tremendous human being, and I was thrilled to get a phone call from him, and he said, Feng Zhang, and I had met Feng and David months before, just various networking things that they were doing to think as they were thinking about companies and other activities they were doing. And he said, Feng and I, and Jim Collins have an opportunity. And I knew right away what it was that they were talking about. And I said, I'd really like you to meet with Jim. And I had breakfast with Jim, and Jim expanded the notion of all the things that we were thinking about. When I first heard about this, I thought this is an incredibly precise method that can be decentralized for testing in ways that I'd always hoped diagnostics could be, but it was starting to give up on because I just hadn't seen the innovation. And Jim started talking about all the aspects of technologies that the company was considering, and it was CRISPR based, it was synthetic biology based, it was combinations thereof. And as we had more of the conversation, I was convinced it was an even greater opportunity than I had originally thought based on the early work that I had read. And so then I got the opportunity to meet the rest of the team, and it's a very expansive list of founders, including Pardeep Sabeti and Deb Hung and Todd Golub and Omar Abadeya and Jonathan Gutenberg. And it's just an incredibly passionate group. And so not only was there a lot of enthusiasm about the technology, there was also this unifying vision around making a difference and affecting healthcare. And it was the appropriate thing, I think, at that time to be moving diagnostics into a next generation of not just technology, but into a broader healthcare framework, and understanding that the framework had to change along with the technology. And it was just such a consensus among the team that I was hooked from the beginning. And then we started working on it in early 2018. March is when I came on board to help drive the process and really drive the process. And we launched the company in March of 2019, closed the capital in April of 2019, and are launching product just about a year later, which is something I hadn't planned on doing.
I know. So between March of 2018 and March of 2019, when you actually launched the company, I imagine you had to license the technologies out of the Broad and Harvard OTD. You had to line up financing. You had to think about what the management team would look like. Give us a sense of that, because there are lots of people in the audience who are sort of interested in it. Like, for example, what was it like to license the technology from the Brotherhood?
Yeah, so it was probably the key aspects were licensing the technology from both the Broad for Sherlock, the CRISPR technology, and from the Wyss for the synthetic biology inspector technology. And it was a really interesting process because everybody was really aligned around the kind of impact we can have. But in the diagnostic space, it was also trying to carve out pieces in an appropriate way that allowed for innovation to continue, but also commercialization to occur. And we struck a balance. So for instance, with the Broad, we struck a balance where their commitment to the developing world was something Sherlock shared, and they wanted very, very passionately to continue development in that area. And so the way we split it was that aspect of CRISPR would stay with the Broad. Sherlock would support it. We continue to find ways to work together around that. And then Sherlock would really address the major markets that needed to be addressed in the early stages to drive the technology and the company forward. All of those learnings would be, shared back to the Broad, so that if that activity continued, we all knew that we weren't going to fall into this limitation that a lot of commercial companies come into, which is you can only have so many programs ongoing. And if the choice comes between a commercial program and a non-commercial program, the non-commercial might win. Now, I think where we've been able to structure it well is that right now everyone's focused on platform development so that we can pull more applications onto the platform. So there is no tension there, and so we're able to do it for all applications. The Wyss and the inspector technology was similar. We retain rights there, though, because the Wyss technology was more independent of instrumentation, which made it easier to access the developing world in low resource settings. And so for us, it seemed that development along those paths would satisfy that aspect without compromising it. So we kept it in-house. So a lot of it was, a lot of what the time was spent on, and it was a lot of time, was around staying true to our mission, staying true to the organizational mission of the academic institutions, but also making sure that the demographics, the communities, the individuals who need to benefit from these technologies could. And I think in the end, we found that balance.
That's awesome. So basically, you did a field of use around geography. Is that how you did it?
Exactly.
Yeah. And you know, it is a platform technology, as you said. And you know, I actually teach a class at Boston University of these platform technologies, and the students work on go-to-market strategies, because that's sometimes make or break for these companies. Is, you know, how do you pick that first application?
Yeah, and so it is the challenge. So in Sherlock's case, the answer was you address a pandemic, and so that doesn't usually find its way into the platform development, and that certainly made it easier. And then there's a pipeline we can build off of that. But the challenge of platforms is something that I've dealt with in past companies as well, and it is one where if you do not move appropriately, and it's not the same kind of platform as, say, the IT space, where the costs of development are much different, the regulation is different, and most importantly, the payer, the customer, and the deliverer of care are all different people in healthcare. So platform strategies differ a little bit. And so the way that I saw it at Sherlock is that the number one key was to have multiple platforms, because multiple platforms de-risk what I think are the standard challenges of diagnostic development. And the first challenge is, do you or do you not need an instrument for your platform? That challenge exists because that challenge is so severe, because if you embark on that development path, you are committing the majority of your capital to that actual instrument. And when you're committing your capital to that instrument, you're also then committing likely most of your resources to a single application, because you have to manage the technical risk around instrument development. And then you're caught in another downstream impact, which is you've got to manage commercial risk around a single application on a single instrument. Right. And so if you're caught in those, well, you get caught in those, and it's hard to avoid those scenarios. The way to me to avoid that scenario was to actually bring on board multiple platforms and deploy them like platforms, and make the applications less dependent on your core instrument or your core delivery mechanism, but robust enough to fit on many others. And that way you buy down the technical risk. You also buy down the commercial risk. So technical risk on the instruments bought down. Technical risk around platform development is bought down when you have multiple platforms as well. And then commercial risk is bought down because you're putting that onto somebody else's instrument, which usually means their channel is going to dominate. Now, the risk you have financially is that you're losing margin through the process. But my experience, and you've done this 5 times over, that there's not a lot of margin in your first few applications, no matter what it is. And so what you're gaining is validation, what you're gaining is channel access, what you're gaining is revenue, what you're gaining are all the things that you need to demonstrate the validity of a platform. And that's how we've addressed it. Now, the balance with the platforms is, how do you choose when and how you deploy them? And so this is where you play to the strengths. And for us, we've been fortunate because we chose them based on their ability to be deployed in different settings with ease in the outset, though in time, they'll overlap probably in all settings. But for now, we can take their greatest strengths with a limited set of applications, deploy them in the settings where they'll have the biggest impact, and then build pipeline and innovation off of those.
Interesting. So great strategy. So from March 2019, you were on that path, and then the pandemic hit. And now suddenly you and every other sort of company on the planet started thinking, you know, is there a way we can help? And so tell me how that sort of came about.
Yeah, that was exactly it. So the decision became very easy when we thought about the mission. the process to get the decision was one where we had to evaluate a lot of factors, and most of all, it was confidence in our ability to deliver. So we had started tracking COVID-19, or actually it wasn't COVID-19 then, it was a novel coronavirus. So back in December of 19, just because we weren't sure what was going to happen. And we were concerned about how it might play out. And sometime along the way through January into February, we actually had team members with family in Wuhan, and we had a number of people with close ties to the region. And so we were getting more firsthand information around it. And in the beginning of February, it was becoming less of a business decision and more of a moral imperative to make a decision. And I remember I felt like we had to do this. Like we just had to do it. If we were going to be true to our mission, if I were going to look my team in the eye every day thereafter, I had to have a good answer to this. And the only answer that I could conclude was that we should make this shift immediately. Now, there were two key shifts. So the first one was we're going to deploy resources to this and put aside other programs, but not all other programs. And so I called the board, because this isn't something, I am a board member, but I can't unilaterally say we're going to change the direction of all the CRISPR activity we're doing in the company. And I was met with the best possible response. And so I called every one of them, and probably best summed up by David Walt, who said, you have to do this. You don't need to figure out what it means for Sherlock economically. We'll all figure that out later. But let's just do it. You want to do it. We want to do it. Let's just do it. And so then I went to address the team immediately after. All 4 other board members were consulted in succession. I couldn't get them all together, but I went to the team and I said, I think we need to make this shift. In fact, I didn't say I think we need to make this shift. I said we need to make this shift. And everybody who's working on CRISPR is going to be working on COVID or SARS-CoV-2. And the team, they rallied immediately. They said, we'll get together, we'll get a plan together, we'll figure out what we're going to do, we'll develop an assay. And in about a week, they developed an assay. But the challenge for the company was we were at that time probably about 15 people. No quality structure, no regulatory structure, nothing that would allow us to get a technology through any process. So we had this assay, but we did not have a way to get it to the market. And so we explored various ways of creating lab-developed tests, research use versions that we could put out there into the market so that people could develop it for their own purposes. And we brought on board some quality experts and regulatory experts just to help think through questions on how we address it. And then I got an email. It was March 16th that the FDA put out a guidance saying, here's how you can do it no matter what kind of organization you are. And I had not read it. 3 days after that, March 19th, I remember vividly the day that our regulatory consultant said, hey, there's a new guidance. I think you can do this. Do you want to do this? And I then had my second call with the board, which was, I want to stop everything we're doing at Sherlock. I want to stop developing all programs. And I want to put everybody onto COVID-19. And by the way, I also want to shut down the company for non-essential people and move them out and just keep R&D on. So at the same time that at the exact same moment that we decided that if you were not in R&D or me, you were not coming into the office. And that if you were coming into the office, the only thing you were going to work on was research for COVID-19 and getting it into and through a regulatory process. That didn't mean that the rest of the team stopped. Everybody outside of the company was also focused on developing the tests in whatever way they could. And so we, on that day, decided, who's allowed to come in, who has to work from home. What does it mean if you're coming in? What are the social distancing policies? So we transformed the organization in within 12 hours. And none of us knew if it was going to work. We just knew we were going to try and we were going to do it our best. And the thing that I will say as a credit to the team is that nobody at any point said we can't do it. Everybody said we're going to figure out how to do it. And so the challenge wasn't whether or not we succeed. It was just how do we define the path to success? And everybody rowed in the same direction.
That's interesting. And so, you had quite a bit of startup funding, right? I mean, from what I read on your website, you raised close to 70 million, I think.
50, 30, 32 in equity, 20 in non-dilutive.
Yeah, and then you also had this organization, Open Philanthropy, who I've not heard of, as part of. So you also had to get the investors sort of, on board on this pivot.
Yeah.
I assume you kept the burn rate the same or not. And are you
on your question, Vinny? I just want to see if my book. No, the burn rate went up. The burn rate had to go up over this period of time because the company we became overnight, even with a limited number of people, wasn't a 20-person startup. It had to be the equivalent of a 2,000-person strong organization that was fully integrated from product concept all the way through to commercialization. Mm-hmm. And so now the question of make buy became the critical question for the company. So the burn rate, it didn't go up dramatically because we stayed lean. And so the way that we addressed it was we are not going to become experts. We're not going to scale manufacturing. Those are unrealistic things for us to pursue. Mm-hmm. There was infrastructure we had to establish, and there was system and process that had to be put in place. And so all of those things were done. But what we really were focused on is what are we good at and what are we not? And for where good ended, somebody else outside of the company had to pick it up. And in some cases, that was a consultant with expertise. In other cases, it was full process management around a major aspect of developing the product. Mm-hmm. And so what we did is we pulled together a network of suppliers, licensors, new licenses that we had to get, manufacturers, distribution channels that would act as our sales agent. Mm-hmm. Because all of that had to be in place well before doing any of this, because much of this has to be reported to the FDA as the structure for the organization when we commercialize a product. Mm-hmm. And so we made a lot of at-risk decisions without contracts in hand. And so did our partners. We made a lot of at-risk decisions without clear view to how we would execute, but we had confidence. And so we basically built a much larger organization than our funding or our size based on belief in the team and faith in our partners. And to our partners' credit, in particular IDT, we announced them yesterday, Integrated DNA Technologies, but they did a lot of work without an agreement because we all believed that this was a problem that transcended either organization. Like either we solve COVID-19 or do our part to say we did it, or we look back 20 years from now and say when we could have done something, we stood by.
Yeah, and your organization is not the only one, right? I mean, there's so many organizations trying to address all aspects of this, whether it's therapy, diagnostics, contact tracing. I mean, there's so many aspects to getting the world working again.
Yep.
There's a RADx program that NIH set up, which is being administered right here in Massachusetts with CIMMYT and UMass Lowell and M2D2. They've received a couple thousand proposals, as of now. The institutions you license this out of are also really busy. The Broad has set up a testing capability. The Wyss is talking about, point of care and spinning out technologies. Where do you guys fit into this competitive kind of environment? It's a horse race, basically. And how do you see it playing out for yourself?
So I think the first thing is, if we saw it as competitive instead of cooperative, we probably would have enabled somebody else instead of done it ourselves. I think we see it as cooperative in that there is a tremendous need for increased testing volumes even now.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a constrained supply chain around that. And most of the solutions are either PCR-based or specific antibody antigen tests. And they're all drawing on the same supply chain. Now, we draw on similar supply chain elements as well. So we're not completely exonerated from that dependency. But we looked at it as we need to increase capacity. And I'll go back to what David Walt and I spoke about, which is let's figure out later what it means for the benefit of the company. And the benefit of the company isn't obscure. What we've gotten out of this is, there are a lot of people who threw their hat in the ring. There are many who threw their hat in the ring and never entered. Their hat's still there. Mm-hmm. We threw our hat in the ring, we jumped into the ring, and we took up the fight. So I think what we've done is we've been able to prove a couple of things around the technology and the company, which are really valuable for any company at my stage. No one-year-old company at our stage of development gets the opportunity to say, we went through the FDA process. None of them in history will ever be able to say they launched the first ever CRISPR product, let alone CRISPR diagnostic. So we got, and what we learned was, what are we really good at when it comes to product development under pressure? And what do we need to do to get better? And so we'll launch product very soon. IDT, will do that very soon. We have already learned there are ways to make this very good product even better, and we're working on that right away. And so we'll go back to one of your earlier questions, which is, what is it like to be in a platform company? Well, when you're in a platform company, the key is to exploit as much value as you can out of the platform. And what we were able to do, the benefit to Sherlock very, very discreetly, is we advanced both platforms and continue to advance both platforms at a rate that puts us years ahead of where we were planning to be. Huh. And I think when you build a company, and you know this well, it's not just the technology. The technology is the one thing that I have very little doubt about when in the company. We are building tools around an incredibly robust set of technologies. I have faith in those things. Now it's about, for me, it was always an execution play. Can we build the infrastructure that will allow the company to compete in a way that leverages the value of those technologies? And I'm more confident now than ever because I've seen us do it, with a small team that wasn't even in the building in its entirety when the time was there. And so I have a lot of faith in both the team and the technology to excel. We need to still do more. I mean, we haven't launched our own programs. We haven't launched our own products. Through a regulatory process that is the standard process. And so the company, what we did is we got a glimpse into the future of the company we need to build, and have realized that part of that is here now, and there's more to do. But now I know what we would have looked like 2 or 3 years from now, and have the benefit of hindsight far in advance.
Yeah, no, there's going to be a bunch of HBR case studies written on this, I think, during this time of how companies accelerated. So the standard practice today is RT-PCR. You keep hearing about that. The Brothers building a big capability. And then there's this sort of LAMP-based technologies that I keep hearing about coming from a number of academic sources as well. How does your diagnostic technology compare against these?
Performance-wise, we've seen very high sensitivity and specificity. So if you look at the data we submitted, our clinical evaluation, which is in our hands, it's 100% sensitive and specific. So it's as good as it can get within the standards we have now. I think what we have learned, though, is that there are ways we can make it better in terms of workflow, in terms of process. We put out the assay we had because of the structure of the EUA process. We learned about our assay through the studies necessary for submission. And so the standard work you would do to make it even more powerful and more, and more optimal, we didn't have time to do. We've learned through the studies where we'd like to do that. And so I think on a performance basis, we're as good. Some places we may be better. I think we'll know for sure when it's actually in the hands of clinicians versus the studies we've done ourselves. So we're following and tracking all of that so that we can make thoughtful decisions around how we improve it if we have to, and also guide customers on how best to use the information. Where I think that we're going to see in the future more advantages, I think we're going to see it in speed. Already we're faster. I think we're going to see it in speed. I think we're going to see it in, no doubt, specificity. I think it's CRISPR-mediated reaction, highly specific. I think the sensitivity, I think, will track from that as well. And I think there are opportunities to improve sensitivity over standard molecular diagnostics as well. And those are within the usual molecular diagnostic frameworks. I think as we think about other technologies and new locations, I think we're going to be able to compete by placing tests where no one else has seen them before, including the home, for molecular.
That's interesting. And so the instrument costs and the per test costs are going to be low enough for it to be a home-based test, do you think?
Yeah, I do. And I think in particular, I think where we need an instrument, markets will bear it fairly easy in understood and defined point of care settings today, and some that are looking for expansion into point of care, which is much different now with COVID-19 than it used to be as to where a CLIA wave device could go. In the home, we actually believe what we'll have is an instrument-free device. So we will develop something that is not dependent on an instrument, but that is also within the cost profile of your standard pregnancy test, as well as the workflow and use case like your standard pregnancy test.
Interesting. And when can you project when that might happen? Because right now you're talking about a central lab-based offering, right? That you're coming out with your partner. Yeah.
So the way that we look at it is, we want and we feel fairly confident that we can develop solutions along the continuum of need for the pandemic response. And I think the first one was what we launched, which was increasing testing capacity, and that's a central lab need. The next one is going to be in those decentralized healthcare locations. That'll be point of care. We're actually in a fairly advanced conversation with what I think is a really, really impressive and differentiated point of care technology. And we will hopefully develop something that is applicable in the fall, provided the EUA structure is still in place, and I think it will be. The at-home test is going to be a little bit later. I don't have an exact timeline on that. I do feel like we are on a development path that will lead to an impact during the pandemic. But we're early on, so I don't want to throw my hat in and not enter the ring. So I'm going to hold on when I give the exact date on that. But I do feel confident that we have a team that can deliver.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The idea of a point of care test that is quick and can identify viruses versus viral versus bacterial infections, things like antibiotic susceptibility, all these, they've been the holy grail. There've been so many academic technologies and spin-outs around that. And it suddenly feels this pandemic has brought that opportunity to the forefront. It was always hard to fund those kind of companies. And so do you think that now that we're actually going to end up out of the pandemic with these low-cost point-of-care devices to help with infectious diseases, bacterial infections, et cetera?
I think that so you raised two distinct points that I think are worth building on. The first is, what is the appetite compared to prior to the pandemic? And then the second is it a reality? When I think about the first question, I go back to when I gave a talk about the vision Sherlock has for transforming global epidemiology around infectious diseases, and how the cascade effect of testing at home is going to change that, because we're going to keep people at home who won't be spreading disease. We're going to alleviate pressure on the healthcare system. We're going to increase the doctor to patient ratio. And we're going to reduce overall costs, because we're not going to put unnecessary burden on the system. It wasn't easily accepted in October. Today, everyone is much more keen to accept this as a reality. Now, what prevents us from getting to that reality and that vision is technology and implementation of technology. And so, to my eyes, I don't believe that the answer is a small instrument that everyone's going to pay a couple $100s for to put in their house, because what it takes to maintain an instrument, what it takes to do that. I think in chronic diseases, I actually think in oncology spaces like that, we'll see the equivalent of diabetes and coagulation management at home, where you will have an instrument. But I think for things that are acute in nature, we'll see more of the questions and more of the challenges and demand that exists for the rapid dipstick tests, pregnancy tests, and things that are to that extent. And so I think if you're not developing something along that line, the burden is high. It's not impossible. I do think people can succeed there. But I think the burden to enter the market is going to be difficult. And I think that we need to be very, very aware of our biases as an industry towards the acceptable product configurations for healthcare structures versus the acceptable product configurations for retail, consumer, and other non-traditional healthcare industries. And that's a really important shift that we have to affect. And I think I think we will do it.
Yeah, I know it really seems that way, and hopefully the payers will, come along behind it, and money will be found, which has always been a problem. But
I have a slightly different view, and I may be naive in the view, but I think that I think that the value of this is going to be by moving some of that expense away from the payer and into a different system. There's an ecosystem that doesn't exist today because there aren't infectious disease or similar diagnostic results available with the accuracy of the lab at the home. And I think when that happens, we're going to see a shift in the players who are drawn into the market to be supply chain players like Amazon, telemedicine players who are going to transform how it is we deliver health, and things that actually are really valuable when you're not leaving the house to affect the epidemiology. Today, no matter what, you still are, because you can't get the diagnostic result. And so we take for granted that we cannot build a healthcare system around a home-based health intervention network. But I do think we can do that now.
Yeah, I guess it's more akin to the Fitbit world, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a quantified self market. We're just going to expand it into infectious disease. Well, Rahul, this has been an amazing chat. We're a few minutes over sort of our allocated time. But thank you so much. Wishing you enormous amount of good fortune, and and part of the Massachusetts story of how we're going to lead the world out of the pandemic. Well, if anybody can, we can. So thank you so much. And for everybody, the platform is going to be open till 6 o'clock to network, and you basically are going to be able to see who's on what tables. You can jump between tables. I hope Rahul will stick around, and some people may want to chat with him as well. In the future, if you're having issues and seeing who's around the table, please fill out your profile. It takes a couple of minutes to add your photo and your LinkedIn link. And if you do that, it makes it easier to find other people on these tables. We're still learning this platform. It's the only second time we've used it. I think it's getting better. It has restrictions on browser types and stuff, but we're working our way through it. So once again, thank you to Dr. Dhanda, and let's go grab a drink and let's move to our cocktail networking session.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was a great pleasure. I appreciate you listening to my story.
Wonderful. So hopefully somebody